A little while back, I saw a Reddit post and linked article, both written by Joshua Wood. It went something like this. Brackets are a useful tool, but they have limitations. They do cover power level to some extent, but they don't address specific play pattern preferences aside from following general community preferences, such as limitations on mana denial in lower brackets. A good solution to this problem is to have players come to the table with a basic 10-second pitch for what their deck is doing. An example of this might be, this is my Gonti Canny Inquisitor rogue deck. It's a theft deck that wants to hit people with evasive rogues to steal cards, and eventually pump up my rogues for the win. It's bracket 3. First thoughts? This is fine, a very normal opinion to have, and a reasonable suggestion. I already do some version of this, as do most people I play with in public. At least half the time when I'm reading the commander of a stranger I'm playing against, or when I make a comment about it, they'll drop me a basic pitch for how they're using the commander or what their deck is doing. The only critique I might have of this idea is that it's maybe a little odd to have a pitch like this rehearsed word for word and delivered like some sort of theatrical monologue, but the broader point about communication is good. Or so I thought. This post was not all that popular on r/EDH. 63 upvotes and 89 comments at the time of recording, with some comments critical of the idea getting more upvotes than the post itself.
Revealing what your deck does by playing it sounds way more fun to me than everyone giving a synopsis on how the game is going to go before it even starts.
You don't need to tell other players your deck's life story, an interesting fact about it, or even a basic strategy. Once everyone chooses their commanders, and commanders are revealed, they can deduce strategies from there.
Leaving some mystery to the game is fun. It means we can play to figure out each other's weakness, instead of basically being told.
In the broader scheme of things, this doesn't matter. A modestly visible Reddit post attracted some people with opinions I disagree with, who then got a handful of upvotes. Big whoop. However, I can't get this line of thinking out of my brain, and these opinions are similar to comments I've received on my channel in the past. There seems to be a large online faction of Commander players who think this way, who treat Commander as some sort of detective game where a large part of the gameplay is figuring out what's going on in opposing decks, or alternatively as some sort of show that you wouldn't want to spoil the ending of. So, I'm going to take this Reddit post and its comments as a jumping off point to talk about that broad faction, this group of players that I find fascinating, and I'm going to see if I can figure out what motivates their thinking, why they're like this, and if there's anything to the vision of Commander they strive after. As a disclaimer, this video is more conceptual and social theory oriented than most of what I make, so I'd recommend treating it as some fun ideas to chew on rather than cold hard facts to destroy the libs with or whatever. Though, this is sort of a soft response to the Trinket Mage's video about me in April, so I guess this can be cold hard facts to destroy him with.
Part 1. EDH players are aimless goblins, wandering through the world looking for meaning.
EDH is typically played as a casual format, which simply means that players aren't necessarily expected to try as hard as they can to win, either in-game or during deck building. This is challenging for people because in any sort of game setting, a lot of people will instinctually look for some sort of goal to optimize toward. We can see this play out in something like D&D. Role-playing games are even more casual than casual EDH in a lot of ways, but many players will still put a lot of effort into making their characters as powerful as possible in combat. This is kind of pointless on a party level, since the DM can literally make combats easier or harder on a whim to suit the players, and even harder in a way that's targeted to a specific player. Still, the power level of a character remains a thing people optimize because they need some sort of goal while building out a character sheet. Something needs to motivate the decisions being made. The same goes for EDH. People will create goals in the deck building process, and one of those goals will frequently be making a deck that is good under some set of criteria, at least if you're not one of the mythical bracket 1 gamers. So that will be a part of deck building, but what about in games? There are all sorts of skills tested in a competitive 1v1 Magic environment. Turn sequencing, mastery of a given deck list, assessment of opposing threats, probabilistic thinking, playing to outs, and so on. A 1v1 Magic tournament will stress test a player's skills in all of these things to the limit, and in many cases, games will be won and lost by the collective weight of a lot of tiny decisions. As in deck building, EDH's more casual nature makes things trickier in the sense that winning isn't as dominant a goal, and plays that are suboptimal in the strict sense might not necessarily be considered misplays in the same way they are in 60-card formats. As a result of this, a lot of EDH players subconsciously go looking for something to replace some of these competitive skills, and in a format as diverse as EDH, a very common substitute is knowledge. A certain and fairly large subset of EDH players seem almost obsessed with knowing as many possible plays their opponents can do as possible. This is especially true for players playing at a level with sudden ways to win, where not being able to recognize a combo piece or a central enabler for an opponent's deck can rapidly lead to a game loss. Whether it's as an outlet for an underutilized competitive instinct, or as a trauma response to getting OTK'd one too many times, being able to shrewdly navigate the ins and outs of opposing plays and figure out how threatening a particular card is within the entire landscape of the EDH format is a skill that a lot of players have built up. This is especially true for commanders. A lot of commanders have a handful of cards they pair pretty powerfully with, and having it locked away in your dome what those cards might be for a given commander can give you a leg up in determining the possibilities for what an opponent might be doing. And, if we assume that most decks within a given commander will be somewhat similar, having an encyclopedic knowledge of commanders and what their typical decks look like can actually serve as somewhat of a replacement for Rule 0. I don't even need to have a conversation with my opponent. All I need to do is see that Teysa pull up, and I'm already squaring up for some Ashnod's Altar BS. So this is a skill that a lot of players have put effort into honing, whether consciously or unconsciously, and it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of them want to use this skill. And, for a player who has spent a lot of time around various Magic cards and is fully engaged in a game, it's not hard to imagine this being a lot of fun. I see my opponent play a Blood Artist effect, and I start looking for possible loops. Think about what sack outlets and supporting pieces are in color for my opponent. I see a Karn's Bastion hit the board, and start trying to deduce what counters are soon to pop into existence. I see an opponent with 2 lands untapped on my turn, and I try to figure out what sorts of disruption they might be able to put together with red, blue, and white mana. I would be lying if I claimed that the description of the commander format I just laid out doesn't sound like fun. It's appealing to play a game like that. So what's the problem? Surely there's nothing wrong with people enjoying the format this way.
Part 2. EDH is already an unbelievably information-dense format, dingus.
Comedic name-calling aside, this is my most basic issue with the vision of the Commander format I just presented. I dedicated a full 20-minute video to this topic last summer, but here's the short version. The EDH format has become effectively the onboarding format of Paper Magic, the way new players get into the game, and the way a lot of them continue to play the game. This is cool in a lot of ways, and there's one especially new player-friendly element at the heart of the Commander format. It doesn't have a meaningful metagame. You don't have to learn the opposing decks you might be facing and figure out what decks can fare well against those. And more importantly, you won't have to worry that your deck will be too weak to face the competition. This is wonderful for creativity and deck building. 60-card Magic typically relegates creativity or brewing to players with a relatively strong grasp of a given format. But since EDH lacks a metagame or set power level, players of any skill can innovate and create something of their own rather than needing to net deck. This is an undoubtedly nice feature, but on the flip side, this lack of a metagame ironically poses an entirely different set of challenges onto players that aren't found in a competitive 1v1 format. You can't learn the 4 most common decks you'll be playing because there are thousands of possible decks you might find yourself facing. This might be manageable in a play group with unchanging decks, but playing out in the wild with strangers is a whole different story. Any set of 4 EDH decks will likely have more than 200 unique non-land cards, which is a fair amount to learn if the decks are unchanging, and an ongoing gauntlet for newer players in a public setting where each game might present dozens of new cards. I think most of us have been in a game among strangers where it becomes clear that one or more players are checked out from what opponents are doing, fatigued by the process of keeping up with all the new cardboard that's hitting the table. So that's the case I'm trying to present here. EDH has 3 times the opponents and often around 10 times the number of unique cards in opposing decks as compared to 1v1 formats. There are 30,000 cards legal in the format now, and thousands of brand new cards entering the format every year. Each deck tends to play far more permanents than are seen in 1v1 formats due to the high life totals and the multiplayer aspect of things, and the result is that boards rapidly clog up with assorted permanents for players to keep track of. The information density of EDH is untouched by any other widely played format, and that is a feature about it that we need to keep in mind when we're playing it. All of this is why I find the knowledge competition version of casual EDH a little frustrating, and seek to reduce it as much as possible. And that's as somebody who is probably better equipped to threat analyze than at least 80% of EDH players. It's not that I can't figure out how potentially game-ending a sequencing of opposing plays is on the fly. It's that I don't think that should necessarily be a constant task expected of all EDH players. The game of figuring out what my opponent's deck does is just not one I think is beneficial to have at the heart of the EDH format. There are even plenty of days that I personally wish to avoid this part of the format, to kick my feet back and focus on resolving my cascade triggers instead of Sherlock Holmesing my way to what the white-knuckled power gamer across the table is packing. But still. With all that said, I could still see somebody thinking that I'm throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. Sure, knowing a rough outline of what opposing decks are doing might reduce the mental load of the format and make it more approachable for all people, but what about the theatricality of it? What about surprises and zany moments and unexpected twists?
Part 3. The Grand Reveal, or how to be terrible at creating compelling social experiences.
A fairly common mistake that's made among newer game masters in a role-playing game like D&D or Pathfinder is placing too much importance on their own predetermined plot, and especially trying to create plot moments that will generate a notable reaction in players. This strange hilltop village? It's actually on the back of a massive creature. Whoa, dude! Now you're telling me these past 5 sessions have all been playing out in the mind of Jackson the Frost Dragon during his fight with this world's real enemy, Lord Xyrox? What a revelation! This isn't to say that creating unexpected plot beats is never a good idea, but it's not a good thing to dump most of your effort into as a GM, or to make a load-bearing centerpiece of your campaign, because it's not really what makes a multiplayer RPG fun. Most players aren't showing up to sessions to be recited your half-baked book idea. They're there for collaborative storytelling, for experiencing funky situations outside the realm of reality, for throwing around die rolls, and getting to play the fun character they crafted. It might feel good to imagine your big reveal getting the same emotional response as some other big moment that arises organically, but that's not necessarily going to happen. At this point, you're probably asking, what does this have to do with EDH, Alex? Well, a very similar dynamic takes place there. I dedicated a whole video to this topic about a year ago, but the basic idea there was that there are some inherent and unavoidable problems with decks that like to win in some grandiose way. I have a deck that wins by getting 3 Fiend Hunters into play at the same time to Fiend Hunt each other indefinitely and cobble together an ETB-based win from there. I also brewed a list with the goal of casting Rogue Rock an arbitrarily large number of times, before Jessica-ing all 3 of my opponents for an also arbitrarily large amount of damage. These are undoubtedly flashy as far as win cons go, and they really play into the showing off side of EDH, the part of the format that is driven by the desire to have strangers ooh and awe at the cool things your deck is doing. In principle, this is fine, but in reality, you tend to get the desired response a lot less than you'd expect with this kind of deck. EDH is already full of combo decks that can pull off cool, explosive wins, and even if your combo deck is a cut above the rest, it's still putting together a handful of cards that abruptly end the game. Effectively, this sort of deck ends up being more fun to build than it is to play. It's fun to build and tune a deck that does something wacky and unusual, but something being fun to think about, fun to theorize, fun to hear described as a concept, doesn't necessarily make it fun in an actual game. Because that's what EDH is, a game. It's not a museum of cool card interactions, it's not a collaborative art installation, it's not a competition to see who can do the wackiest thing, it's a game with players and pieces and goals. It's not identical to a conventional board game, obviously. In the best of times, I'd argue it can be much more interesting than your average medium complexity board game. But it should be a lot closer to that than it is to reading off a list of the most interesting things you can do with Second Harvest. So that's my precautionary note about funky combo decks, and it also applies to any deck whose main game plan is a bit of a one-trick pony, such as a deck that is built to cascade into a particular threat every game. Still, I'm guessing that argument probably isn't all that persuasive to a lot of people in the context of pregame conversations. Sure, a deck that plans to win in some sudden, dramatic way shouldn't be hiding its game plan, but what about cool plays that aren't game-winning? Are you just asking me to cough up all my deck's secrets for my opponents to see? To spill the beans on my deck's cool intricacies? If I'm to be totally honest, I don't quite know how to respond to this sort of question, because to me it's a clear indication that the person saying it and myself are really not on the same page about the terms of the discussion. So let's get on the same page. What is the purpose of a conversation at or near the start of a game where players describe their decks? 2 things. 1, it's a Rule 0 conversation. Anytime you're mentioning the bracket of your deck, how it plans to win, and what its most powerful plays are, you're giving your opponents the opportunity to decide if they want to play against that. This is why I find combo decks that win in some cool way the most relevant example. Even if you'd quite like to keep your cool combo a secret to put on some sort of dramatic performance for anybody watching, when you're playing that sort of deck, you should really be making it clear to your opponents that that's what you're doing. This could be as simple as saying, I'm playing a deck with a combo win that frequently happens around turn 7, which gives your opponents the tools they need to decide if they want to be in this game with a moderate speed combo deck. In contrast to this, a deck whose cool thing isn't a combo win might not have this sort of relevant obligation in the Rule 0 phase. The other purpose of a start of game conversation is getting players calibrated about what's to come, and I actually think of this as the more important purpose. A lot of players will be okay playing against a somewhat spicy deck, so long as they get some idea of what to expect and what to watch out for. With my most powerful deck, my Francisco Malcolm deck, I'll generally tell my opponents that my deck is fast with frequent turn 5 wins, and that it usually wins with Time Sieve. And with these two things in their pocket, my opponents will have a decent idea of what to watch out for, and the tools to make strategic decisions against my deck. Likewise, with my Sharoom deck, I'll tell my opponents that my deck is a control deck built around Astral Slide. This is an exceptionally short description of my deck that leaves dozens of cool interactions unmentioned, but it communicates the two most important facts my opponents might want to know: that my deck will be able to exert more leverage over the game the longer it goes, and that flickering permanence is a central part of my game plan. Performing this sort of calibration is good practice because EDH is fundamentally a social format, and one where players should be thinking about their opponents' decks and strategizing the best way to navigate around what their opponents are playing. If players don't have basic information on their opponent's decks, they're in the dark. Who's the threat now? Who might be the threat later? What on board currently is threatening? If you're struggling to make simple decisions because you lack basic information about the decks present, a whole lot of the depth and the skill of the EDH format is stripped out, with a lot of luck replacing it. This also ties in with the information density of the format. In his video about me in April, the Trinket Mage responded to my arguments about the complexity of the format with a game show. He gave me a set of cards played with a specific commander, and asked if I could tell why the given card was in the given deck. As an exercise to devote my full attention to, this was kind of fun. But the issue here is that a real commander game would have a bunch of that sort of exercise, plus threat assessing between different opponents, plus playing one's own deck, plus reading a bunch of new cards if you're not somebody who's already deeply embedded in the commander format. In the context of all that extra stuff, having the slightest leg up by knowing a couple key elements of opposing decks can really help in not screwing up critical threat assessments. All of this brings me back to the people saying, "What, you want me to spill my deck's every secret for you?" If I'm to treat this as an entirely good faith question, I would respond like this. Hi people, no, you don't need to do that. Here's a flowchart. Is the part of your deck you're thinking about a powerful win con for you? If yes, maybe consider disclosing that. If not, is the part of your deck you're thinking about something you'd describe as your core game plan in a way that it'd be helpful to decision making for somebody playing against your deck? If yes, consider disclosing that. If not, you're good. We're talking about a 10-second or less pitch. You obviously don't need to spill the beans about a cool side strategy chilling deep in your 99. But you shouldn't need to hide the main game plan of your deck or conceal the most powerful win con. To put it bluntly, if giving somebody a synopsis of what your deck does ruins your experience playing it, it wasn't all that interesting a deck to begin with. In all of this, I've also been dancing around a final group of players, the people who think deception is a critical part of the Commander format. This is not generally a group of players I have a high opinion of, though to be fair, some of it might be a sort of trauma response to playing with assholes. Some people in the Reddit thread that inspired this video mentioned concealing what their deck is pre-game so opponents don't try to switch to a deck that counters it, which would be a fair consideration if you accept that people treating you like shit is something you're okay with in a Commander game. But it shouldn't be. Commander is a social format, and if other people take pre-game communication as an opportunity to be an antisocial bully, that's a problem with them, not a problem with communication as a concept. There's also another group of players who specifically try to trick their opponents as a strategic play, trying to sneak through wins, specifically taking advantage of opponents lacking knowledge of their deck. This is admittedly a spectrum. There are lesser versions of this, like sandbagging plays and playing the small bean with a late game centered deck. And while I personally don't really care for this sort of table engagement, I understand that it's naturally going to be part of a multiplayer social format. But players doing the more serious versions of this, downplaying an obviously busted board to somebody who doesn't know any better, pretending that a powerful centerpiece card is just some normal filler, and otherwise skating by on their opponent's lack of experience, knowledge, or focus, this behavior is toxic to any sort of casual format, and if you need to do this to win, my natural assumption is that you're not very good at Magic the Gathering.
Part 4. So, is talking to your opponents good or bad?
This video has been kind of meandering, and has involved various different arguments in favor of open communication, as well as various arguments against the opposite sort of table behavior. Despite this, I'm less single-minded about this than you might think, and there are some pretty reasonable arguments for less table disclosure that I've heard in the past. One of these is that treating less experienced players as full-fledged commander players, as well as not trying to baby them with lots of extra treatment, is both more respectful and a better learning environment for a lot of players. This is an idea I'm sympathetic to. Different players do well in different environments, and a situation where everybody else is playing with the kitty gloves on might not necessarily be the ideal one for learning the format, depending on the player. Although, I think this reasoning can work the other way as well. When I play a very impactful card, I'll generally emphasize it to the table, oftentimes saying something like, "I attempt to cast Captivating Crew." To me, this is saying to my opponents, I'm doing something that, of course, you all as sensible players who know my game plan might want to stop, and I'm respectfully giving you the opportunity to do so. Same reasoning of respecting my opponent's capabilities as players, but in this instance it leads to more table communication rather than less. Regardless of where you go with this idea, it is important to remember that different players learn better under different circumstances, and we should never assume we have the one-size-fits-all solution to teaching, playing with, and showing respect to other Magic players. A related argument that I find compelling is that overemphasizing Rule 0 as a part of the game can encourage a mindset of fear and avoidance in newer players, rather than the curiosity and openness to experience that arguably makes for a better experience in Commander. If players are immediately told to watch out for stacks, to avoid mana denial, to fear infect, to not play mill, to disrespect discard, and to ask for no goad in their games, suddenly you end up with a bunch of players who exist in echo chambers and avoid experiences they find even slightly uncomfortable. The Trinket Mage has discussed how newer players in his games have had relatively neutral reactions to humility of all cards, seeming curious about this card they'd never seen before, more than anything else. While I don't think I'd try this with one of the most oppressive stacks pieces in the game, the broader point is an interesting one. Players are subtly influenced by the ways other people react to cards, and when they haven't been taught to hate and fear a card, they'll be more engaged and more prepared to problem solve when playing against it. This is also part of why I care more about the establishing expectations part of a pregame conversation than I care about the Rule 0 part. It's valid for players to not want to play against a particular thing, but I'd rather play in a landscape where the list of hard no's for players is a bit smaller, and an alternative to keeping something like stacks or combos out of the game altogether is disclosing these things up front and allowing players the time to prepare themselves for these things, rather than getting blindsided later. As general practices, your opponents should know about the most threatening parts of your deck because that's the part they might want to strategize against. Your opponents should know the strongest win con in your deck, not just so they can decide if they want to play against it, but also so they can decide how they should be playing against you once the game starts. These suggestions might feel frustrating for the people used to grabbing at every strand of advantage and playing close to the chest for a better shot at winning, but I can promise you they'll make for better Commander games and a healthier Commander ecosystem in the long term. The final takeaway I want to impart here is simply that the EDH format being accessible or good for new players or for players who play less often or so on, none of these considerations are binaries. I will happily admit that much of the EDH format's information density is inherent to its basic construction. The number of players, the deck size, the higher life totals, all of these things are factors in producing overwhelming games for players. The lazy response to noticing this is to throw in the towel before you've even begun thinking about it. EDH is complicated, so it's pointless to take any steps that might make it more approachable or more enjoyable for a wider range of players, a coward might say. The issue with this sort of statement is that the Commander format, along with most other things in life, is not a binary. It can always be modulated one way or another. Even if Commander's inherent features mean that some number of players will struggle with the information density, there are still things we as players can do to decrease the number of players who feel overwhelmed or fatigued, or make the experience of Commander more enjoyable even for the players who aren't keeping up perfectly well. Solutions should be viewed not based on whether they fix all problems, but rather whether they solve more problems than they create. There are undoubtedly some solutions that don't pass that test. Pushing players to run simpler and more conventional decks. Pressuring new players to play a different format instead of Commander, asking Wizards of the Coast to get heavily involved in fixing Commander's information density problem. These are all things that you could argue might help, but they leave open the potential for all sorts of negative side effects. What isn't loaded with potential negative side effects is talking to your opponents. You don't need to share your deck's life story or list out every card, or any other piece of hyperbole thrown out by some denizen of the internet. My video a year ago spent a while going over suggestions, so I'll keep it brief and simple here. Treat your opponents like people you're playing a game with, and give them the information they need to engage with your deck on a basic level. If you're worried that 10 seconds of talking about your deck is going to ruin its fun surprises, that's probably a good indicator that the surprises aren't actually fun, and that all you have on your hands is a gimmick that you and or everyone you know will be sick of in approximately 27 seconds. Finally, it's okay if you enjoy any of the versions of information limited Commander I've been complaining about in this video. I even see the appeal of some aspects of that style. At the end of the day, the biggest takeaway here should simply be to keep audience in mind. What's fun for you isn't inherently going to be fun for other people. What you can handle cognitively isn't inherently going to be handled well by other people, and what works for one table might not work for all tables. Casual EDH is a format inherently built on compromise and collaboration, and leaning into that will only lead to having more fun. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. I recently did a deck review on my second channel, and the flexible UI of Architect was so helpful for both helping me analyze decks and helping me display their different elements. A link to all of my decks is down in the description. Also, shout out to all of these people for being cool creators and lending their vocal talents in this video. A link to each of their channels is also in the description. Finally, thanks to my patrons and YouTube members for their ongoing support of everything I do here. All of you are amazing. I had some extra thoughts about how brackets interact with Rule 0 that didn't make sense to put anywhere in this video, so I've tossed those in a 3-minute video for supporters. I wanted to get this bad boy out the door, so that's not quite finished yet, but keep your eyes peeled for that. It'll be out in the next couple days. Alright, bye.